you saw yesterday's concert.
Of course.
Yeah.
Oh, I did.
Remarkable.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Oh, it was
Amazing.
Speaking of the concert, we had a very cute little Eli singing in our choir.
Yes. Yeah, he was adorable. It's on our YouTube page as well. So you can watch it again. It was just tremendous.
Oh,
It's
I'm
going to
glad
be in our
you,
Macomb at home.
I'm
It's gonna
glad it's
come
on
to Macomb at home, so
YouTube.
you can-
Then my kids can see it.
Oh
'Cause
yeah.
It was
love it.
great.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Very
Really.
special. Very special. Okay. Well, we are now on chapters 9 and 10. And again, there's just so much richness in these chapters. But let me start. What Jonathan Sacks is trying to do here. There are many layers of this book, and one of the things he's trying to do is answer kind of two unspoken questions. And these are troubling questions, not just for liberal Jews, but also Orthodox Jews as well. The first question is about the Exodus. So there is a lot of debate, and well, there's not much debate actually in scholarly circles. It's a pretty settled debate. Most biblical scholars believe that the Exodus from Egypt, as described in the Torah, did not happen at all. Maybe there were certainly migration patterns back and forth. There were people moved back then, just as people move today. I mean, not as much, but there were population movements. But there is zero evidence that there was a group of Semites who left Egypt and journeyed to the land of Israel. There are attempts to show proof for it, but really, from a critical academic perspective, there is really no proof. So why is it there? If this story never happened, then why do we tell it in the Torah? Why is it so central? Now, there are a lot of other questions that the Exodus question raises, but let's just focus. We're going to ask the one question is, so if it isn't true, why do we tell it? Okay, so that's one question. The second question Sacks is trying to answer is, what is the purpose of the Akedah story? That's the story where Abraham is about to sacrifice Isaac. And Abraham seems to willingly go and do it. He doesn't put up a fight, doesn't question it, just goes right ahead and is ready to sacrifice Isaac. So why is that story there? Are we trying to teach about child sacrifice or blind obedience? So Jonathan Sacks is trying to answer these two challenges, and he's trying to do so in a bit of a very thoughtful, subtle way. And that's kind of where this starts off. So I'm gonna turn to the page, and then we're gonna kind of discuss how it happened. So he starts off by talking about how important the Exodus story is historically, right? He says Oliver Cromwell made the first speech of his parliament after the Civil War. He referred to it. Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin included the image of the Israelites crossing the Red Sea. It was a part of liberation theology. It was part of the civil rights movement. So, essentially, Jonathan Sacks is saying this story is so central. And then he's trying to get, so what were the lessons of this story? Now he doesn't pose that question that I posed at the beginning. Why is it there? Because he's Orthodox. So he's not going to question the historicity of it. However, I suspect that he, as a, he's an academic. He knows the arguments as to that it probably didn't happen. So he wants to give an answer to the purpose of the Exodus story that answers any objection. So that he wants to show that God would have included the Exodus story even if it didn't happen, that it doesn't really matter whether it happened or not. So he gives us a couple of answers. He says one reason for the Exodus story is that it shows that it offers a new paradigm for how history works. That it used to be that only power dominates, and that always, in every case, the powerful win over the powerless. That history is simply a story of power, and that in that traditionally, as we understand, most of history is the powerful survive, the powerful oppress the powerless, and they write the history. And that essentially uh, the Torah, the story of the Exodus, reverses that. And it says, actually, God is on the side of the powerless. And here Sachs says, it was to become the cornerstone of a new social order. That is the Exodus, one never before seen on the stage of civilization. The experience of the Exodus was to shape the entire political vision of the newly liberated people. One day they would find themselves in a land and sovereign state of their own. There would be kings, princes, elites, and hierarchies of power. There would be rulers and rules. In politics, reality rarely answers to the dream. And this is where he says, revolution replaces one set of oppressors with another. That's how most of history has worked. Revolutions replace one set of oppressors with the other. Think of the Soviet Union, right? Overthrowing the czar, creating a whole new power. The chains are new, the bondage old. That could never be adequate to the religious vision of a free society. So Sachs says here, the point of the Exodus is to establish a new paradigm for how a civilization works, that it works based on God's law, not human nature. And that is what the Exodus story is trying to achieve. Now, then we ask, well, then why do we need the Exodus story? Couldn't God have just said, couldn't God have just simply said, I'm on the side of the powerless, you should form a new order in which, that's governed by laws and not power, and that should be the way that you live? No, because there has to be an experience. And here's where he also gets to the story of the Akedah, and I'm going to come back to that. And this is on page 113. What we have, we eventually take for granted. Only what we lose and are given back again do we not take for granted, but consciously cherish and constantly protect. The sequence of events told time again in different contexts is one of the axes of Jewish spirituality. Nothing is more natural. And now he gets in. But what he's trying to say here is we only appreciate what we lose and then gain back. So essentially, the Exodus story has to happen because the Jewish people has to appreciate the beauty of a free society, and they have to stay committed to a free society. Therefore, they have to experience slavery in order to truly cherish freedom. That's the whole purpose of the Exodus story. So the Exodus story has to happen. It's a if you're thinking of a logical proof, it's a precondition. The only way that the Jewish people can create a free society is if they experience slavery at one point or another. So it's axiomatic. Now, that helps us understand the point of the story of the Akedah. Here it is. This is also on page 113. Abraham and Sarah had a child because they so nearly did not have a child. Never again, after their experience, that is the experience of the Akedah, could they or their descendants take children for granted. The years of waiting, the disappointments of Ishmael, the near loss of Isaac burned into Jewish consciousness the knowledge that generational continuity does not simply happen. Judaism became and still is that rarest of phenomena, a child-centered faith. And here, Sachs draws the implicit connection between the Exodus and the Akedah. Just as Abraham and Sarah lost and were given back their child. In other words, they lost him when God said, go sacrifice your son. At least symbolically, they lost him. They didn't really lose him, but theoretically, symbolically, they lost him. So the Israelites in Egypt lost and were given back their freedom. There it is. That's the connection between the two. So this is very, again, Sachs is utterly brilliant here. So what he is doing is he's essentially saying, even if the Exodus didn't happen, we can imagine that the Israelites lost their freedom. And because they lost their freedom, they therefore appreciate the freedom that we have now and work hard to assure that that freedom will never again be lost. And that's the same thing that happened to Abraham and Sarah. Symbolically, not really, not in fact, but symbolically, they lost their son Isaac. But then they gained him back because God rescinded the order to sacrifice. And because they symbolically, they experienced the loss of Isaac, they knew that they could never take for granted the next generation. And so therefore, Jews have always been committed to preserving the next generation. Does this make sense? It's really remarkable what he's doing here. Sue, go ahead.
Yeah, it seems to me that this is a good lesson for all of us, because so often in life, many of us don't appreciate what we have until we don't have it anymore.
Yeah.
I think with all kinds of experiences and things, sometimes you wish for something and then you realize, but what you already had, you didn't need to wish, because what you already had was as good, if not better.
Beautiful. Yes. That's exactly right. And so this is some kind of confirming that point of view.
Yeah.
Dad, go ahead.
Well, yes, to go on to what Sue said, it fits our time now, doesn't it? I mean, so many people have lost so much during this past year, which should make us appreciate what we've lost once things kind of settle down and the losses are much less. So it's kind of prescient for what we're going through now.
Yes, exactly. Very much so. But what Sachs also says is that it is in human nature to then take it for granted. So unless we consciously create ways of remembering, that's why the Passover Seder exists. It is a forced way of remembering that experience of slavery and the deliverance. And in traditional Judaism, the Mi Chamocha is said 3 times a day, every day. So in a way, we forced ourselves through rituals not to take it for granted, because in human nature, we tend to take it for granted. That's just, it's how we're built. So we have to almost fight against that natural tendency. Yeah, Jill?
And still, even with today, what's going on today, aside from COVID, we're threatened with the loss of democracy. So maybe that will help us appreciate it and help us fight to keep it.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. It's everything hangs on a slender thread. You know, that's sort of the part of the lesson here. And what Sachs is saying, freedom, and we could say democracy, it hangs by a slender thread. It could always be, it's easily lost. We have to take conscious effort to keep it. And he's also saying generational continuity. The idea that Judaism goes from generation to generation, that kind of hangs by a thread. We don't know whether that's, we don't know whether that's really going to survive in that way, that we will survive in that way. And so we have to make every effort to try to pass Judaism on as best we can, because that hangs by a very slender thread. So this is part of what he's trying to say in this lesson. Okay.
He says it very clearly at the bottom of page 113. I think that last line there on page 113, it begins by taking freedom lightly, assuming that once gained, it will continue of its own accord, forgetting that it exists and is sustained only by constant vigilance and repeated acts of self-restraint. Right. It's I mean, your dad used the word prescient. I actually had written that, and I wrote that in my marginalia right on that sentence, actually.
That's right. That's right. Here, and this, Exactly, exactly. And this is also on 114. Before they could taste freedom, not merely live it, but taste it with the starburst of flavor that only a starving man knows when he tastes food, they first had to lose it. The experience of slavery became, for an entire people, the matrix of the passion for freedom. It became part of their memory, renewed each year and handed on to their children as a taste of unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Okay, so this is, yeah, who's
It's
next?
Marilyn.
Yeah.
It's Marilyn. I read the chapter and I interpreted it as you did about the freedom and cherishing, not taking anything for granted. But I can't help but think about Sarah. She's not mentioned. She's mentioned about wanting a child and having a child late in life, but this lesson wasn't available to her because of her reaction to the Akedah. So we don't learn that actually from Sarah. We have other lessons that we learn from that matriarch.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. Very much so. Yeah. I mean, yes, Sarah's a critical figure here. Who else? Any other hands here? This is really, this is trying to help us understand why the Exodus story is so important. In fact, let's continue on. Yeah, I mean, this is part. Freedom cannot simply be conceived in the mind and then translated into life, nor is it arrived at instantaneously through revolutionary moments. As the old Jewish saying has it, it took one day to take the Israelites out of Egypt. It took 40 years to take Egypt out of the Israelites. Freedom is the political transformation that occurs only through personal transformation. Yeah, I mean, this is partly what Passover is meant to teach, is we have to experience that journey from slavery to freedom so that we cherish it. Okay, then he goes on page 115 and he kind of says, what is really the origin story of the Jewish people? You know, when did the Jewish people really become a people? That's the question to ask. When did the Jewish people really become a people? Now, you might think the answer is with Abraham, but no, Abraham's not really. Abraham's the beginning of the Jewish family, the clan. I mean, Abraham's it's a tribe, but he's a clan. It's a clan around the children of Abraham. So when did Judaism move from a family clan to a people, to a nation? Now, that's an interesting question. Now, one school of thought says the Jews became a people in Egypt. With the delivery from Egypt, God took a group of slaves, and turned them into a coherent people. That's one answer. And that seems to be generally the common answer that has most been given throughout history. But there's an argument to be made that actually we are a sacred people. We are a chosen people. We are not simply another nation. We are actually a kingdom of priests. That's the phrase that Exodus uses. And that we became that people at Mount Sinai. So what's the beginning of the Jewish people? Is it Exodus or is it Sinai? And that's the question that Sachs asks. And of course, he gives a wonderful answer. And he says it's both. They're both, they are both different parts of our personality. Just as, one individual, you can be a husband and you can be a father. You can be a wife and you can be a mother, and you can be a sister and you can be a friend. We all have multiple facets of our identity. And so there are multiple facets of the identity of the Jewish people. And Exodus and Sinai represent two different parts of the Jewish people. And he uses the phrase, there's a covenant of fate and a covenant of destiny. There's a covenant of history and there's a covenant of faith, essentially. And so Exodus represents the shared history of the Jewish people, that We are a people because we all experienced slavery together. We all experienced slavery together. We experienced the Exodus. We've experienced anti-Semitism. We've experienced the worst in human nature. And it doesn't matter whether you are a priest or a regular Israelite, whether you are in today's parlance, whether you're observant or not observant, we have a shared history of the Jewish people. That's one part of it. And he says that's a covenant. They are community of fate, and that's the covenant in some ways of our past. But then there's the covenant of faith, the covenant of destiny. That's our future. And that's represented by Sinai. That is, and this is where he says, individuals can be bound together as a group, not just because of where they came from, but where they are going to. Not just because of what happened to them, but because of what they are called on to achieve. They share ideals, a common vision. They participate in a collective life with a distinctive set of rules, values, virtues. They are linked not by history, but by destiny, by the journey that lies ahead and the task they have undertaken to fulfill. Such a group is not a community of fate, but a community of faith. Yeah. So that is what Sachs is trying to get at. So the Exodus represents Jewish history. The Exodus represents our fate, our shared history. But Sinai represents our shared values, our practices, the mitzvot, the Torah, and those are both part of our identity. But what's really interesting is Sachs takes this even further, and I don't know if he does this here. Let me check here. He does this in other essays, where he says that actually this covenant is really, it's kind of relevant to understanding Jewish identity today. And he would say all Jews, whether Orthodox, conservative, Reform, totally secular Israelis, that we all share in that covenant of fate. We have a shared history. But he would say that Jews who are not Orthodox, who don't follow the halakha, do not participate in the covenant of destiny. That is the following the 613 mitzvot. So this is where sometimes people, when they criticize Sachs, would say that Jonathan Sachs does not believe Reform Jews are Jews. That's not accurate. He would say if you're a Reform Jew and born to a Jewish mother or converted, you are Jewish. But you are Jewish because of the covenant of fate. He would then say Reform Judaism is not Judaism. Reform Jews are Jews, but Reform Judaism is not Judaism. So he would say we share in a covenant of fate, but Reform Jews are not participating fully in the covenant of destiny. That's what he would say. So this is a very interesting. Comments, questions? You like his analysis? Covenant of fate, covenant of destiny. It's a very innovative way of understanding this. Okay, we got a lot of hands. Andy, Gil, and Sarah.
Well, I think that's very interesting, that way you've explained, and some of my question was answered. But I think there's this place where, how many Orthodox Jews are really part of the ideal of practicing and fate and history, or whatever the two are. I just think there are, it's really hard to pin that many people down as being part of it, and then those being not part of it. I have a lot of questions.
Very good point. So what you're saying is not all Orthodox Jews participate fully in this covenant of destiny. And that is what Sachs would say there is, yes, nobody's perfect, but you at least have to commit to the idea. Orthodoxy is very comfortable with hypocrisy. I'm not saying that in a negative way. It's just true. There are Orthodox synagogues that they know that half the people are driving and they're parking a couple blocks away and then walking the last 2 blocks, and at least would say, well, you're at least honoring the spirit of the law in the breach of the law, so that would be, not ideal, but it is somewhat fulfilling at least you are acknowledging the authority of the law, even if you are flouting it to a degree, or you're not publicly flouting it. You want to think of it that way. Yeah. Gil and then Sarah.
I always thought of who became Jews and when, because prior to the destruction of the Second Temple, Judaism was a offshoot of paganism with blood sacrifices, huge temples, and one single priest. And after the destruction of the Second Temple, as Judaism developed in conjunction with Christianity, it became a religion of prayer, rather, a misstatement. It became a religion of prayer and faith, which is what we have today, whether we're Reformed or Orthodox. We are people of prayer and faith.
Yeah, I think some of that's right. I mean, but I think Judaism is even more than a religion today. Judaism is a people, I mean, the state of Israel. I mean, they're half this country, maybe more, is secular, so they wouldn't identify as they wouldn't identify with prayer and faith, but they identify as being Jewish, so there's still, yeah. I think that's part of it. I mean, Judaism doesn't fit into the traditional categories that we often associate religion. Religion is often seen as a private affair between a human being and God. That's at least how Protestantism sees it. And Catholicism sees it in some ways the same, although Catholicism has an idea of the body of the church. But, think about a confessional in Catholicism. It's the individual and God via the priest. But Judaism is both a people and a religion. In fact, one of the interesting things is there is no word for religion in the Bible, in the entire Hebrew Bible. The closest we get is emunah, which means faithfulness, or it's a sense of you are identifying with the Jewish people and its values and its practices. It's not. The Hebrew Bible has no idea of conversion. There's no such thing as conversion to Judaism. Ruth, who is considered the first convert, she never formally converts. She just moves to Israel and identifies with the people, and that's that. She's Jewish, essentially, because she just becomes part of the people. There was no formal conversion process. That comes later. Sarah? We can't hear. Unmute. We can't hear you.
She's unmuted. We can't hear you.
Go ahead, Sarah. Okay. So we're having some technical difficulties there, but let's just keep going here. No, can't hear you. Okay. So
Put that in the chat, what it is.
Yeah.
Whatever you're asking or want to say, put it in the chat and we'll
put it in the chat. Okay. So we get to this, Revelation at Sinai. And this is very important here. This is on page 118. Covenants were not unknown in the ancient world. They were often made between neighboring kings. 3 things, though, were unique about the Sinai covenant. The first is that it was not made between one king and another, but with an entire people. Before stating the terms of the covenant, God told Moses to speak to the people and to determine whether or not they agreed to become a nation under the sovereignty of God. Only when all the people responded together, we will do everything God has said.
There's certain questions that rabbis get a lot. It kind of asks the question, and this is a question that 5 and 6
Just
did.
happened here.
I think we
Five and
started
six
hearing
did.
the beginning of your lecture somehow.
Okay.
I don't know.
How did that happen?
I don't know. Somebody went back to the beginning on the recording, I think.
All right. That's good stuff.
Yeah.
So, okay. Where was, oh, okay. So what makes this, and Sachs is trying to answer the question, what is special about the revelation of Torah at Mount Sinai? What is special about it? And what he's saying here is there's a couple of unique features that make this special. One is that it's between a God and the people. It's not between one king and another king. If you want to say God is a king, and let's just imagine Moses is the king, even though he's not, but then it would be normal for a covenant to be between God and Moses. No, this is between God and the people. Secondly, and so Sachs says that, the covenant was made between a people and God. There's nothing like this before or since in the history of religion. Ancient civilizations, however they conceive the gods, believe them to be all powerful. The gods might be placated, appeased, or even sometimes outwitted, but they did not submit to laws. The idea of a moral legal covenant between gods and human beings would have been absurd. Yet that is what God proposed at Mount Sinai, and it had vast implications. It meant that right was sovereign over might, and that there is no legitimate government without the consent of the governed, even when the governor is God himself. This, far more than Athenian democracy, is the founding moment of the Western political tradition, with its emphasis on limited government and the rights of the individual. No power, even the unlimited power of God, is absolute. Above kings, emperors, and democratically elected government stands the supreme authority of the moral law. This is the first and eternal defense of liberty, not only against the tyranny of tyrants, but also against what Alexis de Tocqueville and John Stuart Mill called the tyranny of the majority. Now, this is very, very interesting. And anyone who's interested in political philosophy would find this interesting. And one of the basic questions this is trying to answer is, where do rights come from? Where do rights come from? Now, if you are an extreme, I don't want to insult anybody, but if you are a secular, totally secular political progressive, let's just say, not even totally secular, if you are an atheist political progressive, you might say that rights come from government. I mean, there is a coherence to this, that you could be a democratically elected government, and a government comes together, and that government, which is elected by the people, decides what should every person have. There's a famous philosopher named John Rawls. John Rawls is one of the most brilliant philosophers of the 20th century. I believe, I don't know, he was not Jewish, but he did the famous test. It's called the veil of ignorance. And what the veil of ignorance is you in order to design a society, you imagine that you don't know how you're going to be born. Are you going to be born rich or poor, black or white, male, female, gay, anything? You just take a veil of ignorance. You don't know. And so in that veil of ignorance, you decide what should all human beings have access to. And one could say healthcare, health insurance, some basic form of healthcare, maybe a job, maybe not. I don't, this is what he would say is the grounds for political debate, that political agreements and disagreements have to operate within that veil of ignorance. Therefore, most people there would be broad-based rights. And those rights would come from a government which reflects the will of the people. However, the founders of the United States said, no, rights don't come from government. Government exists to protect rights. rights precede government. Rights come from nature. They come simply, if you are a human being, you are born with certain rights. Now, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is what the Declaration says. You know, some people would say it's even more than that, that we're born with other rights. I don't, you know, you can come up with whatever, but the argument from this text, what Sachs is saying is that the idea that the rights of a human being precede or exist independently of any ruler, any sovereign ruler, any king, any tyrant, any government, that our rights are come before that, he says, is revolutionary in history. That this idea had never existed before, that our rights had always been dependent on some external power. And now we're saying we are born with those rights. This is tremendous. Whether he's right or not, whether it's true that this is the best way of understanding rights or not, you know, some people might disagree with this. Some people would say, you know what? We aren't really born with any rights. You know, maybe the rights, there are certain societies that would say we're not really born with any rights. You know, like, I don't know, in China, I don't know, or what rights are people born with? You know, there was a policy where you could only have one child in China. The government could decide how many children you're allowed to have. I mean, there are some cultures. Now, I'm not saying one's right or the other. I mean, I have my feelings about what's right or not, but you know, there are certain societies in which rights are conceived of differently. Rights are conceived of differently. And what Sachs is saying is that the idea behind human rights that we are inherently born with, that comes out of Sinai at this moment. That establishes this idea. Very powerful, very powerful. Questions about this?
I
Where
think
did
it's
rights come from?
interesting that he comes out of the culture of the Magna Carta, you know, for this, right? Being British, I mean, I think Americans, you know, you went right to the Declaration of Independence and stuff. He goes to the Magna Carta when he thinks about this. So he thinks about what gives human beings their rights. You know, it's a compact, the Magna Carta between the king and the people. This is between God and the people, but the people have to join in, right? They can't be governed without their consent. So it's
Right.
powerful.
Right. And even more so, yeah, I mean, the Magna Carta is such an interesting, but he would say the Magna Carta flows out, that the idea behind the Magna Carta flows out of Torah, he would
Right.
say.
Yeah.
But he would even say that this idea of the tyranny of the majority, this is I mean, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison were very attuned to that even a democracy does not always uphold human rights, because if you're a pure majoritarian society, that, you know, if 51% of people agree on something, they could take it away from the other 49%. And that would not be a society that reflects inherent human rights. So in some ways, assigning rights are pre-political. That protects them to a degree. Right. Okay. Questions about this? This is very, I mean, this is this is something that I think exists in these debates exist today. I mean, remember, is healthcare a right? You know, I mean, that is a question. I mean, and if you say it is a right, well, what kind of healthcare? Do you have a right to, you know, plastic surgery the day you want it? Or do you have a right to a healthy, you know, a child? I mean, what are our basic, you know, so Sachs would say some of these questions are political. Some of these questions inherently, certain societies develop their own ideas of rights. So for example, in Canada, people have a different idea of healthcare as a right than, I mean, the majority of people than say in the United States. And in Britain, we have, you know, so some of the way we understand rights, same with something like gun laws. You know, people in America, we have a unique understanding of right to bear arms different than other cultures that where we may be similar in other ways, but some of our understanding of rights are cultural. But Sachs would then say, but at its highest, the most core rights, they are pre-cultural. They exist because they come from God, from being born into the world. Okay. Okay, what else? Any other questions? This is good stuff. Okay, let's keep going then. All right, so Moses goes with human beings, yeah, there's a difference between a freedom and a free society. Basically, what he's saying is that freedom is not just simply freedom from, it's also responsibility to. That you need, in a sense, you need both a Declaration of Independence, but you also need a constitution. You need rights, but you also need responsibilities. And here he says, a free society must be a moral society, for without the rule of law, constrained by the overarching imperative of right and good, freedom will eventually degenerate into tyranny, and liberty, painfully won, will be lost. I mean, this is saying, if you don't have responsible ways of, if you don't have a society that has certain norms and trust and practices to reinforce our mutual responsibility, then freedom can easily be then a clever tyrant can seduce people into giving up their freedoms. This is obviously very relevant. Okay, so then we get to chapter 10, where he talks about covenantal society. Now, this is very important here. And let me give, I don't know if we're going to get through this whole chapter, but what Sachs would say, and he says this in other parts of the book, but within a society, there are multiple ways of understanding identity and community. One would be the government. So that we are citizens. That is our primary identity. We pay taxes, we vote, we care about politics. That's one area of society. Then there's our individual lives. That's with our spouse or our family or our friends or just ourselves. The individual and the state. These are two major arenas of society. And then he would say there's the social layer of society, synagogues, churches, community centers, museums, school boards, places where we interact not purely as individuals, but not just as citizens. We interact as communities. This is, some people call this the third sector of society. But he believes, Sachs would say, that's the most important. Well, maybe not the most important, but is a critical part of society. And what he argues is, over the last 50 years, that area of society where we interact not as individuals purely, and not purely as part of a state, demanding rights, but as people responsible to others and to whom others are responsible to, that sector of society has been ignored. And he blames conservatives and liberals. He say that conservatives fell in love with the idea of the individual, like, in Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, the individual, the Ayn Rand philosophy, that the individual is sovereign, everything. That's one approach. And then he would say that the people like John Rawls became too infatuated with the state. The state can provide welfare. The state can provide jobs. The state can do all of this. The state can take care of you, social services agencies, all of that. He said people gravitated toward one extreme or the other. But what was lost was that middle, those communities of faith, where we are responsible for each other, not because the law says we are, and not because it's in our own, we're selfish and it's good for us, but because we have responsibilities to others. And that is the social realm. And he would say that's essentially what Judaism flourishes in that realm of mutual responsibility for those within our community. That makes sense? He calls that covenantal morality. Comments on this? We can go through it a little bit. Okay, let's see here. Okay. Covenantal society. Okay. Da 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 da. Yeah. Okay. Here we go. This is page
Andy
120.
has her hand up.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. I can't see everyone, so just unmute yourself and talk.
Oh, hi, Rabbi. This is Merle talking.
Merle.
The covenant you spoke of between God and the Jews, does that covenant exist in all religions? Do we think of all religions as covenantal?
Ah, beautiful question. And what Sachs would say is there are multiple covenants. There are multiple covenants that every religion has some sort of relationship with God, but that relationship is unique. Just like every marriage, every friendship is unique, but that doesn't mean one sort of friendship or marriage is superior to another. There is a particular marriage between one person and another person. And then there is the idea of marriage that thousands of people share. And so he would say with covenant that the covenant, there is a Jewish covenant with God. And that's the mitzvot, the 613 commandments, Torah, Talmud. That is our unique covenant. But then he would say there's also the universal covenant of God and human beings. That's, people call that the Noahide covenant. That's symbolized by the rainbow. That's after the 7 laws God makes with Noah. You shall not murder, you shall not steal, so forth. So that's a covenant with humanity. But then individual religions have their own covenant with God too. Absolutely. Yeah. Good.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yeah. Okay. Let's see here. Okay, let's keep going. Okay. Okay. So he's going to bring this is great. The idea without law, or at least this is on page 123. Thomas Hobbes memorably described life as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. For Hobbes, the real danger was that no one could be sure of his or her safety. No single individual is strong enough to be able to protect himself against the concerted attack of others. Therefore, everyone has an interest in the existence of a central power vested in a person or an institution, which can ensure that laws are enforced in battles fought under a unified command. So in other words, Thomas Hobbes is talking about the importance of the state, the importance of the state. The king must be able to levy taxes and recruit an army, okay. And then he says the existence of government involves the transfer of rights and power from the individual to the state. It also involves a risk that that power thus created will become tyrannical and contempt and corrupt. So essentially, Sachs is trying to understand where Judaism fits in these various political philosophies. Thomas Hobbes and others of that said, we need a strong central power, because if we don't have a strong central power, we're going to get destroyed by by someone else. That human beings are pretty bad. We're vulnerable, and without coming together and forming an army and forming some sort of self-defense, we are we will our lives will be nasty, brutish, and short. Okay. That contrasts with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who believed that individuals are basically good, and we need to get rid of government, get rid of centralized authorities, and just we'll be able to live in harmony with each other. Sort of a kind of a naive, we'll all just love one another. As long as we get rid of the bad government and the army and all negative authorities, we'll all just love one another and get along. That's Rousseau. And Sachs, again, positions Judaism in the middle. Judaism, Sachs says, ideally, he's describing the Jewish point of view. Ideally, a society should be comprised of free citizens, none of whom has control over any other. All power structures, therefore, are necessary evils. None is good in itself. So what Sachs is saying is, in an ideal world, if all human beings were good, then Jean-Jacques Rousseau's vision of people just getting along and loving one another and living in total freedom, that would be great. Unfortunately, that's just not how human beings are. We cannot, we have negative tendencies. So he says, biblical Judaism has a carefully elaborated theory of the state. In other words, we have to form governments. Oddly enough, though, this is only its secondary concern. Far more fundamental is its theory of society and its insistence that the state exists to serve society and not vice versa. It's sort of a libertarian approach, but more than that, it's a communitarian approach, communitarianism. The difference between them is that the state is created by a social contract, but society is created by a social covenant. In other words, we need the protection of something larger than ourselves, larger than the individual. So we give up certain rights in order to protect ourselves. And we give up some of those rights to the state, to the government, but that should be limited. Where we should really give up some rights and also embrace our responsibilities is in communities, in covenant. And he said Judaism is the master of that. That when you think about, for example, the Syrian Orthodox community in New York, and they're mainly centered in New York, they take care of there's been articles about this. I mean, their social welfare system within the Syrian Orthodox community is second to none. I mean, if somebody gets sick, when people have a child, I mean, this is true in many Orthodox communities also, the community takes care of them. The community takes care of each other. It's truly beautiful. Now, there are some negatives to that too, and we don't have to get into all that. But what Sachs is saying is that that is sort of the ideal, that a community that honors people's individual freedom, yet and is non-coercive. It doesn't have the power of an army to force you to do something, right? So think about this. If you give, you may feel an obligation to give to Jewish charity, and that is an obligation. And you may even feel social pressure to do that. Hopefully, yes, you do, because we need it. But so maybe you may feel, but there is no army. Nobody is going to come and throw you in jail if you don't give a gift to the synagogue or JUF or any other Jewish charity this year. There's no power of coercion. However, if you don't pay your taxes, what is the ultimate going to happen to you if you don't pay your taxes? You're going to get thrown in jail, or you're going to have to be a big fine, or your wages will be garnished. So that is coercive power. So Sachs is saying that Judaism exists because of there is a communal pressure, a communal responsibility that's non-coercive. And that is the ideal of human existence. Okay, we got into a lot of political philosophy. We're getting towards the end. Let me get a couple of questions. Jill, go ahead.
Understanding that he says we have to have a government to protect ourselves, does he have any suggestions for how to protect ourselves from corruption?
No, yes, he would say the government should be as limited as possible. He would say that essentially checks and balances like we have in the United States, there has to, that the government has to be subject to laws itself, that a president couldn't be put on trial. A president can be thrown in jail. Congress, that even politicians are subject to the law. They have to be. That's the only way. So he would say corruption will happen. That is inevitable. That is part of human nature. Look at the state of Israel. Look, there's so much corruption in the Israeli government. That will happen. The only way to put a check on it is to have limits on what government can do. So there's limits on what government can do. And within government, there's checks and balances. Other comments or questions? So, okay, this is probably a good place to stop because this gets into more political philosophy and we're just about at 3 o'clock. But what Sachs, just to sort of step back and give an overall analysis of what he's doing here, he is laying out a Jewish political philosophy. and this is very important, and this Jewish political philosophy is not conservative and it's not liberal. It's not libertarian and it's not progressive. It is, the closest thing is it's communitarian. It is saying that we are each individuals, but as individuals, we need each other. And the best way to flourish is to be part of communities like synagogues, like churches, like, bowling leagues and things that bring us together, that are not government and that are not individual, but that are community, and that they're volunteer. And that is the ideal kind of society. Okay. I wish all of you a wonderful rest of the week. Yes, Alice, you're right. Buber thought communities were important. Sarah, yes, I think that's a good idea, that Reform Judaism is about the spirit of the law. And yes, I mean, Sarah, your comment here about QAnon and Proud Boys grew up in the social layer. Not all social communities are good. I mean, why do you think some angry people join, white power movements and QAnon and these, a lot of people who join this, they're troubled. They're looking for community, and any kind of community that provides easy answers, is tempting. Not all community is good. We tend to think of community as a positive, and it is, but community is like an inherent human need. And if we can't find a positive community, we'll find a negative community. It's like a kid. It's like any kid in high school. If they can't find a positive group of friends, they may fall in with the wrong crowd, because people are going to fall in somewhere. So community is not always good. But we have to strive to make it good. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, I think joining teenage gangs is another, searching for this social protection and network, which is not always a good thing. But there's a deep human need for that. And reading about QAnon, it's a very supportive community for those in it. And the truth or the lies are reinforced within that social group. But many of the people in there are very socially isolated individuals, and that becomes their main social group, and therefore very powerful in their lives.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. Thank you, everybody. See you next time.
Very good.